My name is Eduardo Schumacher Matos, and I'm the Ombudsman from NPR, as well a professor at Columbia Journalism School. I'm here with Eduardo Stein, a former vice president of Guatemala, who also was a key figure in the Central American peace process, and since then has gone on to become an advisor to the Truth Commission in Honduras and a general expert on Central America and affairs there today. So, Eduardo, thank you for coming here on the 30th anniversary of the dialogue.
Thank you.
We've had some good meetings so far here today, and Central America has figured very big in it.
With a caveat though, every time Central America becomes part of an agenda, normally because we're in a heap of trouble. I would like to have that historical distortions changed. Matter of fact, we've done considerable progress in Central America in recent years, but yes, we still have very dire limitations, shortcomings, imbalances, and more recently, the onslaught of organized crime in the Central American corridor, drug-related, but also contraband-related, and with other illicit activities, is placing a tremendous burden in our societies and in our governments.
Right. Well, I remember 30 years ago when the dialogue started, I was running around El Salvador during the civil war there, and the great concern was insurgencies and guerrillas and define it how you will. And now, 30 years later, when we'd be hoping that this would be a golden era for Central America, we have the drug gangs threatening the governments. Is it that bad again?
Well, in at least 3 of the countries is very serious. In Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, we are experiencing considerable threats to our livelihood, to our very fabric of the democratic states, because on the one hand, we have still weak institutions. We're in the process of strengthening our own justice systems, our own representative systems, and still trying to address some very basic development issues and basic services for the population. But yes, we have made considerable progress in 30 years.
I've really covered the issues in Colombia, and I've covered them in Mexico as well. And we see how, in those countries, these drug cartels can get so much power that they challenge the central state itself. And, originally people say, oh, it's off in the jungle, doesn't bother us, it's an American problem, we'll just let them, live and let live. But it never seems to stay that way. Is there a sense in Central America, are people saying, let's just ignore them, let's leave them in those rural, isolated areas?
Quite the contrary.
They don't bother us.
Precisely because of the Colombian experience, is that there is a centralized or central worry, because we've seen clear indications that some of the cartels have penetrated and have contaminated the court system, Congress, and parts of the executive. And we've seen this more often than not occurring in the structure of the police. There's a lot of corruption within the police forces, even in spite of the formidable efforts within and with the help of international cooperation to address those issues and to cleanse, might be the word, the police corps. So we are trying to build credible, effective public security structures that are not only close to the population and respond to their needs, but that in a way are also capable of resisting the work of these transnational organized crime cartels.
Yeah, but it's so hard. I mean, when you're a local police officer and one of these drug gangs tell you plata or plomo, and you know that they're violent, they really mean it, and they threaten your family, boy, no matter how honest you are, it's really
very hard, but not impossible. And now that we're in the 30-year anniversary of the Inter-American Dialogue, And you started by recalling what was going on in the region 30
Right.
years ago. The fact is that with the help of outside intelligent and savvy, not only intellectuals, but also political practitioners and development experts, we were able to put together agendas in the region as a whole and in each and every one of the countries that pulled us out of that set of conflicts that were more ideological. I remember in several instances many activities that were put together by the dialogue, in which many of us came to really learn from each other in different experiences. It was easier to talk here several thousand miles away from where the fire was going on, but also by bringing over to our region people from the different think tanks here. Political scaffolding would not allow for any outsider to come and mediate in what was considered a strictly domestic issue. Another good example was how we managed to engage the help of foreign governments in nurturing and accompanying the peace negotiations, creating groups of friends. We were so accustomed and over-determined by the overwhelming authority and pressures from the United States institutions and political structures that it was almost a novelty to find that the United States would be one of the member of the group of friends and that will lend their good offices in different capacities to what was going on in Nicaragua and the negotiations in Salvador and later in Guatemala. And a good deal of that was possible thanks to the exchanges promoted by the Inter-American Dialogue.
Right. Well, so here we are at this 30th meeting of the dialogue, or the 30th anniversary. And we've just come out of a session with General McCaffrey, the former American drug czar, really saying flat out that legalization of drugs in Central America would be a bad idea. The United States would, it would be very badly received in the United States, or exactly how he said it, I'd forget. But there was a real frank discussion back and forth about so many people across the table about what people felt were the interests of the Central American countries, of Mexico, of South America versus the United States, and that each country really in the end has to do what it needs to do for itself.
One thing that we really thank Mr. McCaffrey is his frankness.
Yes.
And he put on the table two elements that sometimes are a bit set aside in not only in Central America, but in other Latin American countries. One is the need for solid, sound, publicly verifiable data. We do not have good information about the impact as a public health issue of what the different options of not necessarily an all-out legalization, but a depenalization for individuals carrying, marijuana, or we really lack good information, and we need that information. We lack information about how the transnational criminal organizations work in many instances. We have partial, piecemeal elements of information of how they legalize their illegal earnings or how they launder their money. But what we do know is the formidably corruptive influence that these enormous amounts of illegal money create in our societies. And that's one of the issues in which we tend to disagree with the position of somebody like Mr. McCaffrey. He insists that this is basically a community problem, and that, of course, we know that the community must engage in addressing the consumption by teenagers of illegal drugs, etc. But it is more often than not, and we suffer that in Central America, a regional problem that needs to be addressed as a joint effort by the different countries, the ones producing the drug, our countries, which are a transit group of countries, and those that are the main market. If we don't combine a domestic community approaches that is sound, that rhymes with the rest of the score that needs to be played by all the governments, it's impossible to detain and even begin to reduce that problem in the region.
Given the position taken by the Latin American governments in Cartagena in the recent summit, and starting to speak more with a single voice and demanding that the United States rethink its policy, and given the trends that we see in the hemisphere, could it be that in the next few years or 30 years from now we'll see Latin America going its own way on drug policy, whatever the United States does?
It might be even less than 30 years.
I think it will be less than 30 years.
But the important thing is not that there might be a set position on any single one of the issues.
Right.
The important thing is the need to openly discuss alternatives and have good information to evaluate if they could work or not. Mm-hmm. Another issue that Secretary of State Clinton stated very early in her tenure was the co-responsibility to address these issues, and the recognition, the public recognition of the flow of arms from the United States into Mexico and Central America. But one thing that also worries us is that granted the data of considerable progress that in the United States has been made in reducing the consumption of drugs, why the reluctance in an open dialogue? Well, it was said in the meeting that it's because there's an electoral year here, and that during an elections time, those issues are tried to set aside, and no politician will want to deal with them. And that's why there was such a reluctance that the theme would become part of the agenda in the Cartagena summit. One can understand the political reasoning behind it. We have to sit and wait until the November election takes place to even begin to address these issues regionally, whereas on a daily basis, each and every one of the presidents of our countries receive pressures from the population to address the violence produced by it.
It seems to me that the Cartagena actually showed that the Latin American countries can indeed just go ahead and say what they need to say and say what they want to say when they want to say it, and not be so concerned about what the Americans say or the internal sensibilities of the United States.
I think it was a very solid, concrete gain that the presidents entrusted the Organization of American States to do the research and the policy drafting that is needed to get a collection of proposals in a few months, so that we have a more solid set of options to work with.
Let's talk about Guatemala for a second. It seems like the past is still haunting Guatemala. I mean, aside from what we're dealing with the present, the past still hasn't quite gone away yet.
In a way, yes. Let's say that the peace negotiations successfully ended in a set of peace accords that addressed not only the military fighting between the government and the guerrillas, but also addressed very fundamental development issues. Sort of drafted the elements of a different country that we have the right to aspire to be. And yet some of the imbalances in our society that those peace accords very specifically drafted, identified, or pointed to, and the solutions suggested in the peace accords, some of them have yet to be tackled. We are still a society that has considerable imbalances, a society that still carries within it a huge discriminatory cultural attitude from non-indigenous population to indigenous peoples, which are more than half of our population. And we still have some patterns of exclusion towards the rural areas, which coincide in poverty levels with a lot of the indigenous peoples' territorial historical places. And so what haunts us from the past is not only specific grievances that occur during the internal armed conflict. What really haunts us from the past is an unequal society that needs to address these elements of inequality in a more equitable society.
What do you see happening with immigration coming out of the three Central American countries towards the United States and into Mexico too? I mean, you know, there was this trend of migrants just going to Mexico.
This is another one of the issues that I think needs to be addressed regionally. As you know, we have an agreement between Honduras, Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, which allows for people to freely circulate in the four countries. Mexican authorities and U.S. authorities don't like that because they feel it facilitates, quote unquote, illegal migration to north. But the fact is
through Guatemala, of course.
But the fact is that we've had this circulatory movement of the different nationalities for ages, and it was ridiculous to maintain the requisite of a passport in order to cross the border. So now with any type of ID document, your driver's license, your citizen's ID, you can cross the border from one country to another. This is only a sub-regional facility, really, which has given way to a very intensive circulation of low-income labor force. But on a wider scope, we really need to address those issues, and we hope that after the upcoming U.S. elections, there will be a chance to restate the dialogue on migration issues with Mexico, the United States, Canada, and the southern border countries.
It would make perfect sense. I don't know if it's going to get very far, given the political situation here, unfortunately.
But also given the political situation in our country, well, not much the political, but the security or insecurity situation there. That's part of the things that need to be clarified and regulated as a whole in order to stop and hopefully reduce the crime rate.
You know, the demographic demand to migrate and the migration from Mexico to the United States has gone down substantially. Some of it could be because of the economy here. Some of it's because of enforcement is much better. But some of it is also because the economy is doing well in Mexico and the birth rates really come down. But the birth rates are a little bit higher still in Central America.
Yes.
And you have the situation of insecurity. Is there still the great pressure to come out of Central America to migrate north?
Well, I would say that
don't have any more in Mexico?
I'd say that there's been also a reduction because, as you said, job opportunities here have shrunken. It has become much more dangerous to cross Mexico. But also because there's been, fortunately, an economic growth rate within Central America that, although not enough yet, but still it has opened up possibilities, sometimes with weird effects or unfathomable effects, like for example, Salvadorians are hiring now Nicaraguans to pick up the sugarcane crops in Salvador as temporary workers. One never would have dreamed 3 or 4 years ago that could happen, that one of the most overpopulated countries in Latin America, like Salvador, would be hiring agricultural labor from Nicaragua because they don't have enough people to pick the crops.
Right.
But that's happening, and it is being favored by this type of migratory arrangements.